This video is about the different forms and impacts of discrimination in labour markets. Now, there are a number of different groups that might find themselves unfairly discriminated against in labour markets. I would say probably most commonly it's likely to happen by age, gender, ethnicity or disability. And as well as these different groups that might find themselves discriminated against, there's also a wide range of different forms or types that discrimination can take as well. And probably most common out of those would be wage discrimination. So we actually looked at price discrimination in product markets, about selling the same product to different customers at different prices. And it's a similar idea here. So we'll be having the rate of pay for the same job being different for different workers. And when we looked at price discrimination in product markets, we looked at a few conditions that are necessary for this to be effective, and quite similar conditions actually apply here. So we'd need the employer to have some degree of monopsony power, and that's because in a perfectly competitive labour market, we know that firms and workers are wage takers and they accept the going market wage. So we'd need some wage setting power to be the case for firms to be able to discriminate in that way. They need to be able to identify and separate the different groups of workers. And this is probably actually one of the most important characteristics. You can maybe start to see why some of the above groups might end up being discriminated against more, because usually they might involve some quite observable characteristics. So it's very difficult to hide your gender or your ethnicity, which is why workers, or why employers I should say, might be able to exploit that more easily. We'd need different price elasticities of supply for workers in different groups, so differing responsiveness for changing wage rates in terms of the amount of labour that's going to be supplied. And then finally, we'd need no opportunity for reselling labour. So we spoke about that process of arbitrage, which could happen in product markets where products are bought from one business at one price and then sold on in a different market at a different price. This is really very unlikely anyway, actually, in labour markets, because you couldn't really see a situation where a worker would be able to kind of resell themselves as their labour for time that they've already worked for another firm. A bit like with inequality and poverty, I think it would be very, very easy to talk about the significant moral and ethical problems that we would have with discrimination in labour markets. But remember that we're studying economics here, so the focus of our argument should really be on economic impacts. And a really good concept to use when talking about economic impacts in labour markets is to consider the impact on the MRP, the marginal revenue product of labour. So remember, that is the additional output that adding one more worker is going to bring to the firm. And what we'll find is that the MRP of the favoured groups is going to be overestimated, while the MRP of the groups who are being discriminated against is going to be undervalued and underestimated. And so essentially the MRP curve is the demand curve for labour, and we'll find that that is going to be in the wrong place then for these different groups. So we'll have too little demand for those groups that are being discriminated against, and too much demand for those groups that are being favoured. And so the market mechanism breaks down, and that would lead to an inefficient allocation of resources if we find that demand curve for labour in the wrong place, as we've described there. And I think kind of a knock-on impact of that is going to be that in response to finding themselves undervalued, these groups that are being discriminated against are very likely to start to withdraw from the labour market, because they're quite reasonably going to think, well, kind of what's the point if there's less demand for them, if they're being undervalued in that way, which could lead to the supply of labour being reduced. That means lower human capital for the economy. It means less productivity of the labour force. And remember that labour is a scarce resource. So this essentially is all could be described as a waste of scarce resources. So clearly there are a number of highly detrimental economic impacts of discrimination in labour markets. But when we're evaluating, we do need to consider that it will impact on different groups differently. So it doesn't mean to say that we think it's a good thing in any way, but we need to be able to objectively stand back and say, well, who possibly could be the winners and the losers from this situation? So we could look at the individual workers, and clearly it will depend on whether you are in the group being favoured or the group being discriminated against. So some workers will actually benefit from this if they're being favourably treated as a result of discrimination, and some groups clearly are going to be much worse off about it if they're being discriminated against. In terms of the employers, as we've seen, that it's very likely to reduce the labour supply, it's likely to reduce productivity, which will be a big negative for them, but quite rationally they wouldn't do it if there weren't some benefits for them. So if they can get away with charging or paying lower wages for groups they're discriminating against, then that potentially is going to help them to reduce their costs. And then finally, in terms of the economy, it's actually very difficult to think of any benefits for the wider economy. It is an example of really totally irrational decision making. It's going to worsen labour market outcomes, and as we've seen, it's going to reduce productivity and likely to reduce total output for the economy.